Afternoon, guys. Thanks for stopping by. It's quite a cool day out today. We have a huge fog bank roll in this morning and it's dropped the temperature about 10 degrees. So it's a great day for working in the garden. We had quite a big rainstorm last night, which I think is what's contributed to this fog. But we have some much needed moisture and some much needed coolness after about 3 straight months of really hot, dry weather. So this is good stuff for the garden. Now, before we get into today's video about sun-drying tomatoes, I did want to give you an update on that former spaghetti squash bed that we talked about in last night's video. Now, these 2 spaghetti squash beds in question were the feature beds in a video I did about quick cropping. These 2 beds are destined to become garlic beds this fall. Now, normally, like most of my summer vegetables, the tomatoes and the cucumbers and all the other squashes, zucchinis and pumpkins, in our climate, they normally go until about the first week of October, maybe the middle of October if it stays warm enough. And then all those plants get harvested, and that's when the garlic would go in if that's a garlic bed. Now, the issue with these spaghetti squash beds was that they actually overproduced this summer. And so because they overproduced, the plants burnt out early. So this bed was essentially done in the middle of August. And so the middle of August and even early September is too early to put your garlic in. And so I needed a quick crop to put in there that could be planted and harvested in about 6 to 8 weeks. Now, normally in a situation like that where I need a quick crop, I would resort to the go-to plant family of peas and beans. Now, this spring and even into a bit of summer, we had so many peas and beans that we were kind of done with them for the year. We were just eating too much of them. And to be honest, at the farm stand, they weren't big sellers. Quite possibly because I did sell quite a few starter plants for peas and green beans. People in the area were simply growing their own, so they weren't buying them. So the last thing I want to do is quick crop these beds with more peas and beans. So it doesn't actually leave a lot of options to get a 6 to 8 week crop, especially from seed. So what I decided to do with the 2 beds was sort of do a little competition with a new Escalade spinach that I've been excited to try, and the green leafy lettuce variety that we had in the east beds over there that did so well over the summer. So I planted these beds about 9 days ago with direct seeding. In the south bed, I put the Escalade spinach. In the north bed, I put the green leafy lettuce. With the heat that we had this summer, these actually germinated in 2 days. And so right now in these beds, we're at about 7 days of growth. So as you know from my previous videos, I don't really like direct seeding into the ground. But in this instance, it's really worked. So we have about 5 weeks until the garlic has to go in. So we'll revisit this bed in about 2 weeks and then visit it again when it's time to harvest. Okay, so let's get into the meat of the video, which is why you're here, and that's sun drying your tomatoes. Right now, the first week of September, that is the same time every year that I sun dry my tomatoes. Now on my farm, I do 3 kinds of tomato harvesting, and they all happen at different times of the year. The first harvesting I do is when the earliest, biggest, best tomatoes come out. I harvest them for seeds. Now, because I save all my seeds here, I want the best stock to hold the seeds back, and so I always pick those first ones. And then the second harvest happens throughout the season when you're actually harvesting the fruit to eat, to have fresh tomatoes all summer long. And then at the end of summer, there's a big harvest to sort of clean up the beds. And you usually get two kinds of fruit at the end of the year. You'll get some that are spent, that have blemishes, maybe a little bit of blossom end rot. They just don't quite look as perfect as the ones you were picking in the summertime. You also still will get some good fruit, and that's fine. But it's those ones that aren't quite sellable, that aren't quite as picture perfect as the summertime tomatoes. Those are the ones that we use for sun drying. So the next question becomes, what variety of tomato to use for sun drying? Now here at my farm, we pretty much use Romas exclusively. And the reason for that is that Romas are a paste tomato. So they have very little in the way of juice, and they have very little in the way of seeds. Now this is great because you know, a sun-dried tomato, you're dehydrating it. So if you're already starting with a tomato that has less juice, it is far, far easier to sun dry. Now on top of that, you know, Romas are very meaty tomatoes, so that when you do dehydrate them, you know, you're still left with a pretty substantial product because it's not, you know, 90% water. So having said that though, you can use any tomato variety you want. You know, and I always encourage you to experiment. I was talking to someone on the forums the other day, and they actually use cherry tomatoes. You know, I've never tried that. Maybe I'll try a couple trays of that in my dehydrator this year. Very interesting. Never heard of that before. So now that you've picked your tomato variety to use, you have one of two methods to dehydrate them and turn them into sun-dried tomatoes. Now the first method, the old school method, would be to take your tomatoes, you know, slice them up into your desired thickness, your desired size. You throw them in the oven. You leave the oven about 200, 225. I've even heard of 250, but I think that might burn them. Leave them in there for about 4 hours with the oven door cracked so that the humidity escapes. And after about 4 hours, you should have some nice sun-dried tomatoes, which you can then, you know, sprinkle with spices, olive oil, and a little bit of salt. Now the second method, which is the method we use here, is to actually use a proper food dehydrator, which usually consists of multiple layers of trays with a heating fan on top that sucks the moisture out of anything that's sitting on those trays. So let me go ahead and harvest a big batch of Romas right now, and I'll show you exactly how I set up my food dehydrator for sun drying these tomatoes. Alright guys, so I've harvested my first bucket of Romas. There's about 8 pounds here. Should be enough to get us started. I'll get one of the dehydrators going for now so I can show you what I do. I can show you my recipe. And once it's up and going, I can come out and harvest the rest of the Romas and get the rest of the dehydrators up and running. So once again, my tomato endeavors have been relegated to the downstairs kitchen because this has been deemed to be too messy. So when you're using your dehydrator, generally there's two ways that you can do these sun-dried tomatoes. And one is you can season them after. So you would cut up all your sun-dried tomatoes to your desired size, line up your dehydrator trays, dehydrate them for 8 to 12 hours, and then once they're done, you would then season them with your preferred recipe. Now the way that I like to do it is I cut up all my tomatoes first, and then I put them in this bowl, and I season them in the bowl so that when I'm sun drying them, all the spices and everything I put in this mixture gets infused into the sun-dried tomato itself. So let's go ahead, cut up all these tomatoes to the right size, and then get them in the bowl. And so generally, you know, off a typical size Roma, I'll get 4 slices, sometimes 3. Now you don't want to slice too thin because then your sun-dried tomatoes will just turn to paper and they won't really be sort of the idea of what a sun-dried tomato is supposed to be. And that's this sort of leathery, super rich, super tasty dried fruit. And so I cut mine about this thick. And I always cut them lengthways. I don't know why. That's just how I've always seen them. So let's go ahead and cut all these Romas up. All right, so we should have enough tomatoes to fill one of the dehydrators. I'll just show you the mixture that I use to give these guys a little more pop. So, first off, what I do is I add an acid. And that acid can either be vinegar or lemon juice. The lemon juice ones tend to turn out a bit, a little bit more sweet. But I find the vinegar ones, they have more depth, a little more zing to them. So I think this year I'm going to do more vinegar ones than I am lemon juice. So I got my big bucket of vinegar here. Just going to go ahead and add, maybe half a cup. And so the acid is great because it also helps with the preserving process. Now, I do freeze all my sun-dried tomatoes once they're done. But when I do pull a package out of the freezer, often it'll sit in the fridge for 1 to 2 weeks. So it's good to know that they have the acid from the tomatoes and a further acid from either the vinegar or the lemon juice. So now that we've got our acid in the tomato bowl, we can start lining up our trays with the tomatoes themselves. And so I do them pretty concentrated. A lot of people say, oh, don't let them touch, But quite honestly, after about 2 hours, these guys really start to shrink. So there'll be plenty of spaces in between them. So don't worry about loading them up. You don't want them on top of each other, obviously. But don't worry about loading up the trays and putting these guys back to back. So now that I've got these guys all done, I will then take my spice mixture and put it all over top. Now your spice mixture can be anything. It could just be simple salt and pepper. It could be salt with garlic powder. You can use onion salt. You can use Mediterranean mixes. I like to dry my own herbs. So for these sun-dried tomatoes this year, I'm doing a mixture of dried thyme, dried oregano. I'll do salt and garlic powder. And I've used this mixture before and it turns out phenomenal. Now when these guys are done in about 12 hours, I also got a trick with basil leaves that I'll show you. So I've got my mixture here. And you just want to spread them lightly over top. You don't want to do it too crazy. These guys have a lot of flavor on their own. This is sort of to just enhance them. That's about all you need. All right. So once that is done, we're ready for the next layer. This particular dehydrator has 7 layers, so I will keep doing this until we reach the end. So, a couple of tips, just as we're finishing off the last tray here, is you want to try and cut your slices to be all the same thickness. And the reason for that is you really want them to dehydrate at the same rate. You know, you cut some really thin ones and they'll end up, you know, rock hard and so brittle they'll just turn into dust. Whereas if you cut them too thick, you know, you'll end up with some that don't get dehydrated at all, and they just turn into mush. So when you're cutting them up, try and keep them all the same thickness. Doesn't matter how big you make them, just make them the same thickness. Now the other tip for these guys, and it won't work for every piece because you'll have inside pieces, but you want to put them skin down. The reason for that is they're less likely to stick to the dehydrator itself, especially if, you know, you let the dehydrator run on the long side because you want yours a little more crispy. They do have a tendency to stick. So for the pieces that you can, try and do them skin side down. So that's it for these guys. The motor goes in here. I'm going to set a timer and let these guys run for about 6 hours. I'm going to come back. I'm going to check on them, see what they're like, see what the consistency is like, and then set them up for another 2 to 4 hours. And then they should be done and ready for freezing. So I've got all the dehydrators up and running now. It just started to rain, which is a shame, because usually when I do the sun-dried tomatoes, I run the dehydrators outside. I find it's just far more efficient to run these dehydrators in the outside air, where it can get rid of that humidity a lot more efficiently than it can inside. So it is what it is. You know, the house will be filled with a wonderful sun-dried tomato smell by the end of the day, and that's fine. So before we go here, I just wanted to touch on, you know, the benefits of making your own sun-dried tomatoes. They're a very expensive value-added product at the grocery store, but not only that, you have no idea what kind of tomatoes they're using. You know, it's very rare that you can find organic sun-dried tomatoes. And so being a product that is fairly unrecognizable from the fruit that it comes from, you know, who knows what kind of tomatoes they're actually using. And I don't mean kind as in variety. I mean sort of what condition they're in. You know, food for thought. Now the other thing is, 90% of those sun-dried tomatoes in the store, they're preserved with sulfites. Now, sulfites is the same compound that's in deli meats and other food products that's used to preserve that food. It's not very good for consumption. I would try and steer clear of having sulfites in your diet. So when you're having something as delicious and nutritious as a sun-dried tomato, you don't really want sulfites in it. And so you make your own. You're obviously not going to put that kind of stuff in. You know, the lemon juice or the vinegar or a combination of both, plus freezing them, that's all the preservative that you need. So thanks for watching, guys. As always, leave any questions or comments down below. You know, do you make sun-dried tomatoes? Do you use Romas? Do you use another variety? Let us know how you do it and what you use. And if you got any recipes, write that in the comments too. Click the subscribe button if you haven't already. Now, for those of you that have, I really do appreciate the support, and I'll see you guys next time. Alright guys, so it's been about 10 hours now. Let's have a look at these guys and see how they're shaping up. There we go. They're still pretty soft. Yeah. They're not sticking. I didn't use any oil on these ones. I used to use oil, but you really got to be careful. You know I am freezing them, but anytime you use oil like this, and you're not properly canning or jarring them, you can run into risks of botulism. So I've stopped using the oil, and I'm just using the lemon juice and the vinegar with the spices. And really it doesn't affect the taste. You can add the oil later when you're using these guys in your recipes. So you have several options now for storing these guys. If you're just doing a couple of batches for yourself, a small Ziploc baggie, that works totally fine. For me, because I do this commercially and I do sell quite a lot of these, I will either put them into deli cups, 16 ounce or 32 ounce, or I now have these containers here. So these are a bit more of the pro style clamshell deli containers. I did buy 10,000 of them, so they don't cost me very much. And when I do sell my sun-dried tomatoes, it's just a little more presentable, especially with a nice label on top. So no matter what you use, it doesn't really matter. Just get these guys into some sort of bag or container, throw them in the freezer, and they're good for at least a year. So one round of my medium-sized dehydrator, was able to give me 2 of these 16-ounce containers completely jam-packed full. That's not bad. And we didn't even use all the aromas that we picked. We probably only used just less than 2/3. So for maybe 10 to 15 minutes of your time, I don't know what this would cost in the store. The ones they sell in the store are about 1/3 this size, and they're like $6. So, this is costing you almost $20. And what you're getting is full of chemicals. So you can't even buy this product in the store. But if you could, it would cost you at least $20, $25. And you're getting two of these, for maybe 10 to 15 minutes of your time, and you're just using your end of season production. So it's not like you're taking the primo tomatoes that you were eating in June and July and early August. So really, sun-drying your tomatoes in early to mid-September is a no-brainer. Hey guys, I almost forgot. Well, actually, I did forget. I was going to show you a basil trick at the end when you've finished the sun-drying process and you're ready to put them into their deli cups for freezing. So what I do, these are a couple of the ones that are frozen, is take a bunch of your basil leaves, maybe 4 to 6 big leaves per container. Just stuff them in the top like that. Okay. Close up the lid. Okay. I'll do that with this one too. Right on top there. Okay. Close up the lid. So what that does is it takes that universally loved basil flavor and infuses the dehydrated tomatoes with it. And so by the time I crack into these, say December, they're just packed with so much flavor. It's unbelievable. And, this time of year, we got tons of basil that, within a couple of weeks is going to come out of the garden. So you might as well get some use out of it. So, yeah, it's a little trick that I started about, I'd say 3 years ago. And I can definitely tell when I don't do it, they just don't taste as good.